Edvard Munch was a Norwegian painter, whose best-known work, The Scream, has become one of Western art's most iconic images. Perhaps more than any other artist, Edvard Munch has given shape in his paintings to the inner life and psyche of modern man, and could be considered to be a forerunner in the development of modern psychology. His images of existential dread, anxiety, loneliness and the complex emotions of human sexuality have become icons of our era. Edvard Munch was born in 1863, in a farmhouse in Løten, Norway, to Christian Munch, a doctor and the son of a priest, and his wife, Laura Jelster, a woman half her husband's age. Edvard had an elder sister, Joanne, and 3 younger siblings, Peter, Laura, and Inga. Laura, Edvard's mother, was artistically talented, and may have encouraged Edvard and Sophie. The family moved to Christiania, now known as Oslo, in 1864 when Munch's father was appointed army medical officer at the Akershus fortress. Edvard's mother Laura died of tuberculosis in 1868 when Edvard was only 5. Years later, in 1877, Munch's favorite sister Sophie also died of the same disease. She was 15 years old, he was just 14. After their mother's death, Munch's father sank into a deep depression, so his wife's sister, Karen Jelster, took over the running and management of the house, and helped Christian raise the children. Often ill for much of the winter, and kept out of school, Edvard would draw to keep himself occupied. He was home-schooled by his aunt, and also his father, who taught his son history and literature. He also entertained the children with vivid ghost stories, and the creepy tales of the American writer, Edgar Allan Poe. Edvard also liked to read the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and he illustrated his own copy of the book. Munch's father's positive behavior towards his children was overshadowed by what Munch called his obsessive religious views. He saw the bouts of severe, life-threatening bronchitis and tuberculosis suffered by Edvard and the other children as God's punishing illnesses, to which the sole response should be penitential prayer and remorseful submission. His father, who was violent and harsh, and given to bouts of deep depression, had always expressed a preference for the next world. This amplified the son's sense of the closeness of death. Edvard's poor health, and the vivid ghost stories he was subjected to, helped inspire in him macabre visions and nightmares. Munch would later write, "I inherited 2 of mankind's most frightful enemies, the heritage of tuberculosis and insanity. Illness, madness and death were the black angels that stood by my cradle." It is not surprising that sickness and death left a permanent mark on Munch's childhood, particularly the death of his older sister Sophie, whose suffering he later expressed in several of his paintings. In Munch's never-ending saga of woe, one of his sisters spent most of her life institutionalized for mental illness, and his one brother, who had seemed healthy, died suddenly of pneumonia at 30 years old. Of the 5 siblings, only Andreas married. But he died a few months after the wedding. Only his youngest sister, Inga, who like him never married, survived into old age. These family issues contributed to Munch's own struggles with mental illness and alcoholism, as well as providing the inspiration for some of his most influential paintings. Christian Munch's military pay was very low, and his attempts to develop a private side practice failed, keeping his family in genteel but ongoing poverty. They moved frequently, from one cheap flat to another. Munch's early drawings and watercolors depicted these interiors. By his teens, art dominated Munch's interests. At 13, he had his first exposure to other artists at the newly formed Art Association, where he admired the work of the Norwegian landscape school. He returned to copy the paintings, and soon, he began to paint in oils. In 1879, 16-year-old Munch began training as an architect at the Royal Technical College, where he excelled in physics, chemistry and mathematics. He learned scaled and perspective drawing, but frequent illnesses interrupted his studies. The following year, Much to his father's disappointment, Munch left the college, determined to become a painter. His father viewed art as an unholy trade, and his neighbors reacted bitterly, and sent him anonymous letters. In contrast to his father's criticisms, Munch had an undogmatic stance towards art. He wrote his goal in his diary: "In my art I attempt to explain life, and its meaning, to myself." In 1881, Munch enrolled at the Royal School of Art and Design in Christiania, and also sold his first 2 paintings. That year, Munch demonstrated his quick absorption of his figure training at the Academy in his first portraits, including one of his father, and his first self-portrait. His first teacher and mentor was the naturalist painter and illustrator, Christian Krohn. Initially, Munch's work was heavily influenced by Krohn, who advocated the realistic depiction of contemporary life. Munch's precocious talent was evident early in his training, and developed quickly. 2 self-portraits he created at the time show how he progressed. The first, a small, 3/4 profile on cardboard, painted in 1881 when he was only 18, depicts the artist's classic good looks, straight nose, Cupid's bow mouth, strong chin, painted with a fine brush, and academic correctness. 5 years later, Munch's palette knife work in a larger self-portrait is impressionistic and splotchy. His hair and throat blur into the background, his lowered gaze and outthrust chin lend him an insolent air, and the red rims of his eyes suggest boozy, sleepless nights, the start of a long descent into alcoholism. Later, Munch went on to develop his own psychologically charged and expressive style to transmit emotional sensation. Soon, he would no longer pay attention to his model. "I do not paint what I see," he said, "but what I remember having seen." In 1883, Munch took part in his first public showing, at the Oslo Autumn Exhibition, and shared a rented studio with 6 other art students. In 1885, Munch received a small private grant from one of his cousins, allowing him to participate in the World Exhibition in Antwerp, Belgium, where his painting, Inga in Black, was displayed. It was his first international showing. From there he traveled to Paris, where he stayed for 3 weeks, studying at the Louvre and visiting exhibitions. On his return to Norway in September, he exhibited his full-length portrait of Carl Jensen Yell, a notorious bohemian about town, earning a critic's dismissive response. "It is Impressionism carried to the extreme," he said. "It is a travesty of art." Impressionism had always inspired Munch. Some of his early works are reminiscent of Manet. Many of these attempts brought him unfavorable criticism from the press, and constant rebukes by his father, who nonetheless provided him with small sums for living expenses. Finally, Munch concluded that Impressionism did not allow him sufficient emotional expression. He found it superficial, and too akin to scientific experimentation. He wanted to go deeper, and explore themes of love and jealousy, loneliness and anxiety, sickness and death. In 1885, 22-year-old Munch had his first love affair. He met Millie Tillow, who was 4 years older than him. She was married to the cousin who had recently financed Munch's trip to Antwerp. The secret relationship between the pair filled Munch with lust and passion, but also with shame and ambivalence. Later, writing on the subject, Munch described secret encounters, stormy infatuation, jealousy, and anguish. He was in love with her, but she ended the relationship abruptly after 2 years, leaving Munch tormented, desolate, and alone. The theme of the forlorn man and a dominating woman fascinated Munch. In one of his most celebrated images, Vampire, painted in 1893, a red-haired woman can be seen pressing her mouth into the neck of a disconsolate-looking lover, her tresses streaming over him like poisonous tendrils. This painting set a new record when it was sold for $38 million at Sotheby's in New York in 2008. In another major painting, Ashes, a woman, reminiscent of Millie, confronts the viewer. Her white dress is unbuttoned to reveal a red slip, her hands raised to the sides of her head, while a distraught lover holds his head in despair. In this work, Munch has depicted the breakdown of a love affair, but he also explores the psychology of the moment. The figures appear to be suspended in eloquent gestures, which are difficult to put into words, yet we understand them perfectly. In the early 1880s, Munch's mentor, Christian Krohn, introduced Munch to the anarchist philosopher, Hans Jaeger. He was the head of the Christiania Bohemians, a group of urban artists and writers in revolt against conventional middle-class morality. An advocate of sexual freedom, Jaeger believed that the restrictions and frustrations of monogamy were a source of social evil, and advocated free love, and the abolition of marriage. Munch and Jaeger formed a close friendship, and Jaeger encouraged the artist to draw more from personal experience in his work. Later Munch was to describe Jaeger as the most formative intellectual influence on his life at that time. For Christian Munch, who was struggling to pay the expenses of his son's education, Edvard's association with dubious companions was a source of anguish. He criticized the artist for coming under Jaeger's malevolent, anti-establishment spell. Jaeger, who advocated suicide as the ultimate path to freedom, lived by the code: a passion to destroy is also a creative passion. At that time, contrary to many of the other Bohemians, Munch was still respectful of women, as well as reserved and well-mannered, but he began to give in to binge drinking and brawling with his friends. Reflecting later on his Bohemian friends, and their embrace of free love, he wrote, "God, and everything, was overthrown. Everyone raging in a wild, deranged dance of life. But I could not set myself free from my fear of life, and thoughts of eternal damnation." Munch spent much of 1885, the most active and public years of the Christiania Bohemians, working on a single painting, The Sick Child, his first sole painting. The Sick Child shows his sister Sophie on her deathbed, with his mother crumpled up in grief next to her. The painting has been hailed as the first expressionist masterpiece, and Munch himself described it as the fulcrum of his art and the foundation stone for everything that followed. When the painting was exhibited in Christiania in 1886, it was attacked by critics, as well as Munch's own colleagues, for its overtly unconventional qualities, such as its scratch paint surface, and the work's generally unfinished appearance. But he wanted it to look unfinished, he said. He wanted it to be raw and rough, not smooth and shiny. It was emotion he was trying to depict. The painting was labeled, "a feverish hallucination" and "deviant French art." It caused another violent outburst of moral indignation from the community at the time. Only Hans Jaeger, in a newspaper opinion piece, defended it, describing it as an intuitive work of genius. The devastating psychological effect of losing his beloved sister is intensely revealed in Munch's obsession with this theme, and he painted it many times. His most famous graphic version is this lithograph, created in 1896. It focuses on the girl's head, which is depicted with great sensitivity and empathy. The crude scraping on the stone gives the lithograph some of the same textured quality as the first painting. Later, he described this time of his life. "I could not believe that death was so inevitable, so near at hand. Was she really going to die?" Although his words portray a sense of his hurt and confusion at the prospect of death, they do not fully communicate what he felt. However, it appears that Munch could paint the feelings that he could not describe in words. Disappointed by the public's reception and rejection of The Sick Child, Munch reverted to a more common naturalist style after 1886, in renditions of evocative landscapes, and in portraits that more readily found a market than his Bohemian works. He continued to experiment with a variety of brushstroke techniques and color palettes as he struggled to define his style, and his work continued to veer between naturalistic, as seen in Portrait of Hans Jaeger, and impressionistic, as in Rue de Rivoli. He began to carefully calculate his compositions to create tension and emotion. While stylistically influenced by the post-impressionists, what evolved was a subject matter which was symbolist in content, that is, depicting a state of mind, rather than an external reality. His work, Summertime, Inga on the Beach, was painted in Åsgårdsån, and it is this region's characteristic coastline that appears in so many of Munch's compositions. The painting caused another storm of confusion and controversy, but it hints at the simplified forms, heavy outlines, sharp contrasts, and emotional content that would become Munch's mature style, as he struggled to convey strong emotions. In the autumn of 1889, 26-year-old Munch held his first solo exhibition in Christiania, which was very successful. As a result, he was awarded a state travel grant, and decided to go to Paris, the undisputed capital of art at that time. He arrived in October. It was during the festivities of the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle, and he stayed with two fellow Norwegian artists. His picture, Morning, was displayed in the Norwegian pavilion of the exhibition. Munch enrolled in the Paris classes of the renowned, but somewhat conservative, Léon Bonnat, who had a naturalistic approach in his teaching, and was an outspoken opponent of Impressionism. He spent his mornings at Bonnat's studio, and afternoons at the exhibition, galleries, and museums, where students were expected to make copies as a way of learning technique and observation. Munch showed little enthusiasm for Bonnat's lessons on drawing. "It tires and bores me," he said. "It's numbing." But he enjoyed the master's commentary during museum trips. Munch was enthralled by the vast display of modern European art in Paris, including the works of three artists who would prove influential, Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, all notable for how they used color to convey emotion. In November 1889, Munch's father died, leaving his family destitute. Now head of a financially pressed family, he was sobered by the responsibility, and gripped by remorse that he had not been with his father when he died. The loneliness and melancholy in the painting, Night in St. Cloud, is often seen with this in mind. The dark interior, with the lonely figure at the window, is completely dominated by tones of deep blue. He returned to Norway, and arranged a loan from a wealthy collector, after his own wealthy relatives failed to help. He assumed financial responsibility for his family from then on. His father's death depressed him, and he was plagued by suicidal thoughts. "I live with the dead, my mother, my sister, my grandfather, my father," he said. "Kill yourself. And then it's all over. Why live?" His grief pushed him into a deep depression and heavy drinking. So much so, that he was unable to paint for months. In December 1889, Munch moved back to France to live in St. Cloud, a western suburb of Paris. During this period, he continued to attend Léon Bonnat's classes, until an argument over color resulted in Munch gathering his things and storming out. He never attended a formal art class again. Staying at Munch's lodgings was Danish poet Emanuel Goldstein, and the two, who were of similar philosophic temperament, became close friends. They spent days pondering art, love, death and immortality. Goldstein, who was equally disillusioned with life, introduced Munch to French decadent symbolist poetry, which caused Munch to reform his own views on art. From then on, his paintings began to depict a state of mind, rather than an external reality. In May 1890, Munch traveled back to Christiania and while there, painted Spring Day on Karl Johan Street. The work was strongly influenced by Georges Seurat's pointillist impressionism, however Munch's impatience with the process produced inconsistent results over the surface. Even so, Munch's own style helped to maintain a strong structure, imposing a sense of depth to the picture. Munch received a second state scholarship in September 1890 and returned to France in November, staying at Le Havre to recover from rheumatic fever. In January 1891, he travelled to Nice, staying for 2 months while convalescing. In April he returned to Paris, and there in May 1891, painted another of his Impressionist works, Rue Lafayette. Munch later described the work as a brief revival of my Impressionist period. The work is probably a view from the balcony of Munch's hotel room. In April 1892, Munch returned to Norway from Nice, and spent the summer in Åsgårdsron and Christiania. By this time, he had formulated his own style in which he used color to express emotion. The flowing, tortuous use of line in his new paintings was similar to that of contemporary Art Nouveau, but Munch used line and color, not as decoration, but as a vehicle for profound psychological revelation. The technique is illustrated in this painting, Evening Melancholy, which was considered by Munch's mentor Christian Krohn to be the first symbolist painting by a Norwegian artist. Munch created multiple versions of this expressionist work between 1891 and 1893. Munch said later that the inspiration for the painting was the unhappy love affair of one of his friends. In his painting, the figure of the melancholy man is at the right, and his mood is represented by the undulating shoreline and skylines that extend toward the left. Munch painted another version of melancholy in 1893, exploring the emotion of jealousy. In Munch's circle of bohemian friends, free love was often practiced, sometimes resulting in intense jealousy. Munch reflects these feelings in the painting, showing 2 figures in the background about to embark on a short trip together by boat, and the effect their relationship is having on the man in the foreground. The first version of Melancholy was exhibited in 1891 at Munch's autumn exhibition in Christiania. Also on display was this painting, Evening on Karl Johan Street. The single figure moving against the flow and walking in the middle of the road echoes Munch's own situation as a bohemian and radical artist, hounded by the middle-class authorities in the stifling parochialism of Christiania. After the show closed, the Conservative Union of Berlin Artists, who were impressed with his work, invited Munch, who was as yet unknown in Germany, to exhibit at its November exhibition in Berlin. It was to be the Society's first one-man exhibition. At the end of October 1892, Munch exhibited 55 paintings in Berlin, but as soon as the doors of the venue opened, he heard laughter and whispering among the visitors. People thought that the paintings, with their bright colors, were ridiculous and grotesque, and that they looked unfinished, more like sketches than finished paintings. The press was unsupportive and spelled his name incorrectly, referring to him as Blunch, not Munch. The Munch affair, as the press sardonically labeled the scandal, is considered to be the beginning of modernism in Berlin. As a result of the negativity, the show closed after just 1 week. But it was not all bad. The exhibition went on tour to Cologne, Düsseldorf, and then back to Berlin by the end of the year. The exhibition received a much better reception from the public the second time around. The Berlin exhibition made Munch famous. He spent the next 3 years in Germany in extensive, almost frenetic, exhibition activity, through which he gained a small but influential clientele of patrons. In December 1891, he held a new exhibition in the city, presenting among other pieces, 6 paintings entitled, Study for a Series, Love. This would be the start of what he would later call, The Frieze of Life, a visual poem about life, love, and death, in which the artist worked to portray human life, with all its suffering and emotion. I will no longer paint interiors with people reading and women knitting, he said. I will paint living people, who breathe, and feel, and suffer and love. The original nucleus of 6 pictures exhibited in 1893 had grown to 22 works by the time it was first exhibited under the title Frieze of Life at the Berlin Secession in 1902. Munch constantly rearranged these paintings, and if one had to be sold, he would make another version of it. Thus, in many cases there are several painted versions and prints based on the same image. The frieze of life themes recur throughout Munch's work, but he focused on them in the mid-1890s. In sketches, paintings, pastels and prints, he tapped the depths of his feelings to examine his major motifs, the stages of life, the femme fatale, the hopelessness of love, anxiety, infidelity, jealousy, sexual humiliation, and separation, in life and death. In these works, Munch portrayed women either as frail, innocent sufferers, or as the cause of great longing, jealousy, and despair. Frieze of life motifs, such as the storm and moonlight, are steeped in atmosphere. Other motifs illuminate the nocturnal side of love, such as Rose and Amelie. And the picture, The Day After. In Death in the Sick Room, the subject is the death of his sister, Sophie, which he reworked in many variations. The dramatic focus of the painting, portraying his entire family, is dispersed in the separate and disconnected figures of sorrow. In 1894, he enlarged the spectrum of motifs by adding anxiety, ashes and Madonna. Although it is a highly unusual representation, this painting might be of the Virgin Mary, although this interpretation is disputed. Munch used more than one title for the work, including both Loving Woman and Madonna. In the late 1890s, Munch worked to finish the frieze. He painted a number of pictures, several of them in a larger format, featuring the Art Nouveau aesthetics of the time. Here, he displays the large painting, Metabolism, in a carved wooden frame. In this work, initially called Adam and Eve, Munch reveals his preoccupation with the fall of man, and his pessimistic philosophy of love. Pictures, such as this one, reflect a growing metaphysical orientation in Munch's work, and also reflect the memories of his strict religious upbringing. The entire frieze was shown for the first time at the Hall of the Berlin Secession in 1902, producing a symphonic effect. It created a great stir, both antagonism and approval. The Berlin critics began to appreciate Munch's work, even though the public still found it alien and strange. The frieze was later shown in its entirety in Leipzig, Oslo, and Prague. In Berlin, Munch became involved with an international circle of writers, artists and critics, including the Swedish dramatist and leading intellectual, August Strindberg, whom he painted in 1892. He also met Danish writer and painter Holger Drachmann, whom he painted in 1898. Drachmann was 17 years Munch's senior, and a drinking companion at their favorite haunt, the Black Piglet Tavern. His other paintings, including casino scenes, show a simplification of form and detail, which marked his early mature style. Munch also began to favor a shallow pictorial space and a minimal backdrop for his frontal figures. Since poses were chosen to produce the most convincing images of states of mind and psychological conditions, the figures create a monumental, static quality. Munch's figures appear to play roles on a theater stage, whose pantomime of fixed postures signify various emotions. Since each character represents a single, psychological dimension, Munch's men and women began to appear more symbolic than realistic. Also, Munch became increasingly reluctant to create realistic backgrounds, making his figures seem to be in some indeterminate space. In this way, he was able to focus more on the thoughts and emotions of the figures, and less on their environment. In 1893, Munch created his most famous painting, The Scream, which is an integral part of his frieze of life. There are over 50 versions of the scream, in paintings and prints, other than the painting that is on display in the National Gallery in Oslo. The scream is one of the most recognizable paintings in all art. It has been widely interpreted as representing the universal anxiety of modern man. Painted with broad bands of garish color and highly simplified forms, it employs a high viewpoint and reduces the agonized figure to a stark skull in the throes of an emotional crisis. Munch later described the personal anguish behind the painting. "For several years I was almost mad. I was stretched to the limit," he said. "Nature was screaming in my blood. After that, I gave up all hope of ever being able to love again." The 1895 pastel version of the scream sold at auction in 2012 for $120 million. It is the most colorful of the group, and is distinctive for the downward-looking stance of one of its background figures. It is also the only version not held by a Norwegian museum. The 1893 version was stolen from the National Gallery in Oslo in 1994, and was recovered. In 2004, the 1910 painting was stolen from the Munch Museum, then recovered in 2006 with limited damage. The works have been meticulously restored and are on display once again. Munch often used shadows and rings of color around his figures to emphasize an aura of fear, menace, anxiety, or sexual intensity. These paintings have been interpreted as reflections of the artist's sexual anxieties, though it could also be argued that they represent his turbulent relationship with love itself, and his general pessimism regarding human existence. Many of these sketches and paintings were done in several versions, such as Madonna, Hands, and Puberty. They were also transcribed as woodblock prints and lithographs. Munch hated to part with his paintings because he thought of his work as a single body of expression. So, to capitalize on his production, and to make some income, he turned to graphic arts to reproduce many of his paintings. Munch admitted to having personal goals for his work, but he also claimed his art had a wider purpose. "My art is really a voluntary confession, and an attempt to explain to myself my relationship with life," he said. "It is a sort of egoism, but I am constantly hoping that through this, I can also help others achieve clarity." This lithograph, created in 1896, illustrates the point. It is rich in passion and emotion, and it rides the line between dark and beautiful. The woman is very powerful. Her head is held high, and her expression is comfortable and careless. The man at the bottom left of the image is vulnerable. As he nuzzles her neck, he pleads with her, craving her attention and mercy. Here Munch expressed an ambivalent opinion about love. "They are rocked in the embrace of life's waves, and the woman's smile is a smile in death," he said. While initially attracting strongly negative reactions, in the 1890s Munch began to receive some understanding of his artistic goals. As one critic wrote, "With ruthless contempt for form, clarity, elegance, wholeness, and realism, Munch paints, with intuitive strength, the most subtle visions of the soul." Edvard Munch was one of art's great printmakers. He initially created these works for financial reasons. He could sell them for far less than his paintings, and regarded printmaking as a way to boost his income. However, as an artist, he was drawn to the endless diversity of inking, assemblage, and materials, as well as the experimental character of printmaking. He is thought to have created more than 700 printing plates throughout his lifetime, each producing between 20,000 and 25,000 impressions. Arguably, this makes him the most prolific artist printmaker in history, surpassing even the influential Pablo Picasso. Munch began working with dry point and etching in 1894, and, while he continued to produce prints using these methods throughout his career, lithography, with its greater capacity for reproduction, appealed to him more. Drawing on stone, with a lithographic crayon, was as easy as drawing on paper, and he found it generally a more sensual experience. Although Munch would continue to work with lithography for a number of years, the weight of the heavy Bavarian limestone required for the technique was too much for him, and, in 1896, he switched to woodblocks, which became his primary print medium for the rest of his life. Munch was highly creative in the woodcut medium, and few artists have dared to try his approaches because of how creatively and actively he handled the material. He devised a method for dividing his blocks into separate areas by using a jigsaw. These puzzle-like shapes were then inked in various colors before being assembled and printed in one pass. In 2006, the color woodcut The Lonely Ones, seen here, set a new record for his prints when it was sold at an auction in Oslo for the equivalent of $1.27 million. It also set a record for the highest price paid in an auction in Norway. Munch's printmaking style, as well as the bold composition and color palette of his paintings, deeply influenced the German expressionists of the early 20th century, including Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and August Macke, and they did much to foster a revival of the technique. Characteristically though, Munch shunned the role of mentor. He preferred to stand apart. In May 1896, Siegfried Bing held an exhibition of Munch's work at Bing's Maison de l'Art Nouveau in Paris. The exhibition displayed 60 works, including The Kiss, The Scream, Madonna, The Sick Child, and The Day After. Bing's exhibition helped to introduce Munch to a French audience. However, many of the Parisian critics still considered Munch's work violent and brutal, even if his exhibitions received serious attention and good attendance. In 1897, Munch returned to Christiania, where he also received grudging acceptance. One critic wrote, "A fair number of these pictures have been exhibited before. In my opinion, these improve on acquaintance." The good press coverage gained Munch the attention of influential patrons, and he described the turn of events in his diary. "After 20 years of struggle and misery, forces of good have finally come to my aid in Germany, and a bright door opens up for me," he said. Munch's financial situation had finally improved, and he bought himself a summer house facing the fjords of Christiania, a small fisherman's cabin built in the late 18th century, in the small town of Oskosron. He named this home the Happy House, and returned there almost every summer for the next 20 years. It was this place he missed when he was abroad, and when he felt depressed and exhausted. "To walk in Oskosron is like walking among my paintings," he said. "I get so inspired to paint when I am here." Edvard Munch was apprehensive about women. He believed that they deprived men of creative energy, sucked life out of them, just like vampires. And there was nothing more disastrous for a man than a love affair. Even so, in the summer of 1898, Munch began an intimate friendship with Tulla Larsson, a liberated upper-class woman, and the unmarried daughter of a wealthy wine merchant from Christiania. The relationship lasted only 4 years, and it was tormenting, painful and devastating for both of them. 29-year-old Tulla was enraptured when she first met the famous artist, and was strongly attracted to him. They traveled together to Berlin, Paris, and Florence. She wanted to marry him, but Munch resisted. We can get an idea of what Munch was thinking at the time, from his painting, The Dance of Life, which reveals the choices he faced. The figure on the left in white is the young Tulla Larsson, the woman Munch can marry now. On the right, the figure in black is the aged Tulla Larsson, the woman she will eventually become, after they are married. The two figures in the center are Munch, and his first love, Millie Thurlow. In the picture, Munch has a choice between a free life and marriage. The free life is depicted by his dancing partner, his first love, as well as the frivolity in the background scene. Marriage is depicted in the bookends of a young and an old Tulla. The painting is thus both a dance of life and, for Munch, a dilemma. Munch got cold feet. He made it clear to Tulla that he was faced with a clear choice between his work and her, and he chose his work. He left her behind and traveled back to Berlin, then to Paris, Dresden, Italy, and Switzerland. She reportedly pursued him across Europe for the next year, and eventually convinced Munch to propose. In the autumn of 1899, he agreed to marry her, on the condition that she adopted his surname, and that they lived together as brother and sister. Unsurprisingly, Tulla was less than enthused by this prospect, however she persevered, and even dealt with all the paperwork for a marriage, but Munch sabotaged her efforts. He deliberately treated Tulla neglectfully, rudely, and sometimes even aggressively, to alienate her and to demonstrate that no good could ever come from him. However, the unyielding Tulla didn't give up. 2 years passed, during which Munch was simply too cowardly to break with Tulla. He needed her money to survive, but resented any mention of the fact. In the summer of 1902, he received a visit from friends, who reported that Tulla was in a state of deep despair, and had attempted suicide. Munch immediately went to her, imagining Tulla to be dying. He found her alive, but weak, and resolved to take her to his house in Oskosron to recover. There, he got drunk, and what happened next has never been clearly established, but a gun was fired, the bullet hitting the middle finger of Munch's left hand. Munch himself claimed he had no clear memory of what happened. He wrote that he lay on the bed, half awake, bleeding, and smelling gunpowder. The last thing Tulla did in Munch's life was to call a doctor for him. They never saw each other again. Later, Munch sawed a self-portrait depicting himself and Larsen in half, as a consequence of the shooting and subsequent events. Tulla finally left Munch, and married one of his younger colleagues. Munch took this as a betrayal, and he dwelt on the humiliation for some time, finally channeling some of his bitterness into new works. His paintings, Still Life, The Murderess, and The Death of Marat, created between 1906 and 1907, clearly refer to the shooting incident, and the emotional after-effects for Munch. Unfortunately, Munch appears to have blown the event out of all proportion. He actually lost just the tip of his finger, which he later described as a monstrosity that everyone stared at. As a result, he never showed this hand in public, or in painting again, always ensuring he wore gloves. Edvard Munch had severe mental health difficulties during his lifetime. He is believed to have had borderline personality disorder, which is characterized by fear of abandonment, chronic feelings of emptiness, impulsive behavior, and various other symptoms. Munch also displayed alcoholism, an impulsive trait often associated with this illness. His drinking, which had long been excessive, grew uncontrollable. The rages were coming more and more often, he said. The drink was meant to calm me down, especially in the morning, but as the day wore on, I became nervy and angry. His continued drinking, and constant travel in France and Germany, together with his dramatic romantic involvement with Tulla Larsen, resulted in Munch trying to overcome his alcoholism in a sanatorium at Kornhaug in 1899. Munch's younger sister Laura, who suffered from schizophrenia, was the subject of his 1899 painting, Melancholy. Here, Munch not only portrays Laura's tragedy, but his own dread of the madness he might have inherited. Munch claimed that he wanted to record his sister's dark, mute, unrelenting sorrow. Despite the fact that he suffered from ongoing depression and anxiety, Munch refused treatment for his mental illness for some time. "My sufferings are part of myself and my art," he said. "They are indistinguishable from me, and their destruction would destroy my art. I want to keep those sufferings." Munch recognized that the link between his psychological state and his paintings was important, and he was reluctant to risk losing his talent. In the autumn of 1908, Munch's anxiety, compounded by continued excessive drinking, smoking and brawling, had become acute. As he later wrote, "My condition was verging on madness. It was touch and go." Experiencing hallucinations and feelings of persecution, Munch was persuaded to check himself into a private sanatorium. After 6 months in hospital, his drinking reduced, and he regained most of his mental stability. After returning to Norway in 1909, he settled down in Kragerø, south of Oslo. In several letters, Munch expressed his enthusiasm for his new home. Just weeks after his arrival, he wrote, "I am now working full-time. I feel as if I am at my artistic peak. Never has my work given me so much joy." Yet, it was principally through his work of the 1890s, in which he gave form to mysterious and dangerous psychic forces, that he made such a crucial contribution to modern art. His new paintings were more positive and extroverted, but lacked his previous intensity. The general public, however, began to warm to his work, and museums began to purchase his paintings. He produced several full-length portraits, of high quality, of his doctors, friends and patrons. These were honest portrayals, devoid of flattery. He also created landscapes and scenes of people at work and play, using a new optimistic style, with broad, loose brushstrokes of vibrant color and frequent use of white space. He rarely used black, and made only occasional references to his usual morbid themes. With more income, Munch was able to buy several properties, giving him new vistas for his art, and he was finally able to provide for his family. His first American exhibition was in 1912 in New York. At the beginning of the 1900s, the University of Christiania decided to build a new and larger Great Hall, known as the Aula. Money was set aside for art and wall decorations. This became a prestigious commission, which was highly sought after. In 1909, artists were invited to submit designs for the wall decorations, but the committee rejected them all, as many did not meet the requirement to complement the style of the neoclassical building. The decision created quite a stir. The commission was important to Munch, who had just returned from Denmark after treatment for alcoholism and a nervous breakdown. He saw the project as a way to renew his image in his native country, and the commission became the center of his attention. After a second design submission, which was also rejected, he decided to publicly exhibit his pictures for the Aula so that people of Christiania could see them and make up their own minds. In his work he used motifs that represented the university and the sciences, based on the folk wisdom of the Norwegian people. He combined this with a tribute to the sun, as the origin of all life. The public liked what they saw, and supported his work. Finally convinced, the committee gave the commission to Munch in 1914. The centerpiece of the installation is the painting The Sun. It is a massive canvas, more than 7 meters wide. The sun is depicted as all-pervasive, shining from the heavens onto the land and sea, its rays providing support for all life on Earth. In 1916, the paintings were installed in the University Aula. Today, they are the only paintings by Munch that still hang in their original space, right where he thought they should be. This major work in Norwegian monumental painting includes 11 paintings, covering 223 square meters. When he had finished, Munch said, "I wanted the decorations to form a complete and independent world of ideas, and I wanted their visual expression to be both distinctively Norwegian and universally human." With the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Norway, like Sweden and Denmark, issued a declaration of neutrality. Norway was badly hurt by the war at sea, about half of Norwegian merchant shipping being lost. The war found Munch with divided loyalties, as he stated, "All my friends are German, but it is France I love." Isolated from his German patrons, Munch found a Norwegian audience to be his most attentive for the first time since the 1880s. Landscapes gained renewed importance for him. Portraits of leading industrialists, financiers, politicians, cultural figures, and their families became a major means of income. Unfortunately, new commissions, of the stature of the Orla murals, such as wall paintings for a planned city hall in Oslo, failed to materialize. Along with his new fame came wealth, but not serenity. In 1916 Munch bought a former plant nursery, called the Eekli Estate, on the outskirts of Oslo. The estate consisted of 11 acres of fields, apple trees, bushes and shrubs, and eventually, several large outdoor studios. Munch lived at Eekli for the next 28 years, until his death, maintaining his distance from an alternately adoring and scornful public. In 1919, he caught Spanish flu, which was the worldwide pandemic of that year. Given his poor health history, Munch felt himself lucky to survive. Munch was nearly 60 in 1921, when he was commissioned to paint a frieze of 12 large paintings for the Freia chocolate factory in Oslo. The paintings were installed in the women's canteen in 1923. The factory owner had decided that for the female workers, only the best was good enough, so he got Norway's greatest painter, Edvard Munch, to decorate their canteen. With women as the main characters, the paintings depict everyday scenes from the resort towns on Norway's east coast. Munch received the equivalent of €10,000 for his work. During the early 1930s, painting became more difficult, because Munch contracted an eye disease. In 1933, on the occasion of his 70th birthday, he was awarded the Knight's Grand Cross of the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olav, a special Norwegian decoration intended for those recipients deemed exceptionally worthy. 3 years later saw his first exhibition in England. It was also the occasion of the publication of 2 extensive monographs on his work. In 1937, the Nazis labeled 82 of Munch's paintings as degenerate, and removed them from exhibition in Germany. The opportunities for showing his work, in Norway, or anywhere else, decreased dramatically, although auctions of his works from German collections demonstrated continued demand for his art. In 1940, the Germans invaded Norway, and the Nazi Party took over the government. Munch refused to have anything to do with them. He was 76 years old, with an entire collection of his art in the second floor of his house, and lived in fear of a Nazi confiscation. 71 of the paintings, previously taken by the Nazis, had been returned to Norway through purchase by collectors, including the Scream and the Sick Child. They were hidden from the Nazis. During the war, Munch withdrew into an isolated existence that focused on his increasingly self-referential art, and on growing crops at his 2 estates. At the time, he created a number of unflinchingly revealing self-portraits, which explored the theme of an old man facing the prospect of death. In this painting, Self-Portrait Between the Clock and the Bed, Munch looks like a man who has held himself back from the dance of life. He appears awkwardly squashed between the grandfather clock and the bed, and looking as though he shouldn't be occupying the space. In December 1943, tributes poured in for his 80th birthday, but he was suffering from a severe cold, from which he failed to recover. Munch died in his house at Eekli near Oslo in January 1944, about a month after his 80th birthday. The Nazis held his funeral for him, giving the appearance that he was a Nazi sympathizer, which he was not. Upon his death, the Norwegian authorities discovered a collection of 1,010 paintings, 4,445 drawings and 15,390 prints, as well as woodcuts, etchings, lithographs, lithographic stones, woodcut blocks, copper plates and photographs. In his will, Munch left his entire estate to the city of Oslo. The collection formed the basis of the Edvard Munch Museum, which opened in Oslo in 1963, to celebrate the centenary of his birth. In 1946, the city of Oslo bought the Eekli estate from Munch's heirs. The house was demolished in 1960. In February 2012, a major Munch exhibition, Edvard Munch, The Modern Eye, opened in Frankfurt. The exhibition was opened by Crown Prince Haakon and Crown Princess Mette-Marit of Norway. In 2013, 4 of Munch's paintings were depicted in a series of stamps by the Norwegian Postal Service to commemorate the 150th anniversary of his birth. In addition, Munch's image appears on the Norwegian 1,000 kroner note, along with pictures inspired by his artwork. In 2016, a version of Munch's painting, The Girls on the Bridge, sold for $54.5 million at Sotheby's, New York, making it the second highest price achieved for one of Munch's paintings. Edvard Munch's work had a profound influence on later artists. His innovative and emotionally charged style played a pivotal role in the development of expressionism, symbolism, and even elements of abstract art. His use of vivid colors, distorted figures, and dramatic compositions laid the groundwork for the expressionists to explore the inner emotional and psychological states of their subjects. His exploration of emotions, symbolism, and psychological depth left an indelible mark on the art world, and his work continues to be celebrated and studied by artists and art enthusiasts facing the uncertainty of a rapidly changing contemporary world today. Yet, in a final irony of his difficult life, Munch is famous today as the creator of a single image, the Scream, which has obscured his overall achievement as a pioneering and influential painter and printmaker.